Good afternoon, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you're in the know. I'm Bob Friedman, founder and chair of the Corporation for Enterprise Development, a 35-year-old nonprofit working to ensure that every American has a reasonable chance to go to college, start a business, buy a home, create a future for her family. I'll also be your moderator for today's program. You can find us at commonwealthclub.org, on Facebook and Twitter, and on your YouTube channel. And now on to today's program, the key to regaining American opportunity and fiscal freedom. I must say I'm very excited to be able to participate in this program. We've all seen the massive gridlock that's paralyzing Washington. Extreme partisanship is keeping policymakers from addressing key issues of education, the economy, housing, and public welfare. But some of this also has to do with the legacy of our fiscal policy. The obstacles it creates do not allow us to move forward on a path to prosperity. Expansive public programs and locked-in tax cuts are leaving us with ever more limited options. Any budget growth will be consumed by dying boomers like me, squeezing out investment in the younger generation, the first generations of Americans likely to do less well than their parents. Our speakers today will discuss how they've come to this point and what we can do to move forward. Let me say a little bit about each of our speakers. Dr. Gene Sterly is the author of Dead Men Ruling: How to Restore Fiscal Freedom and Rescue Our Future. You can find that at deadmenruling.com. He's a fellow at the Urban Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Treasury. Gene literally wrote the book on budget and tax policy and is one of the prime architects of the last great tax reform, the 1986 Act. More information on his book can be found at www.deadmenruling.com. Frank Yeary is co-founder and chairman of Level Money, a financial app that empowers young adults to take control of their finances. Frank is also director at Intel Corporation and chairman of Camberview Partners, a corporate advisory service. He previously was vice chancellor at his alma mater, UC Berkeley, and prior to that, he ran one of the leading mergers and acquisition advisory businesses on Wall Street. Gene and Frank come with different public and private sector solutions to our impasse that transcend traditional political lines and offer great, and I might say, needed hope. They will lead us off with a few remarks, and then we'll respond to your questions and have a panel discussion. Please welcome Dr. Gene Sterly and Frank Yeary.
Well, thank you, Bob. I should say it's an honor for me to be here for several reasons. One, I'm a great admirer of both Bob and Frank for many reasons that go far beyond our discussion today. The Commonwealth Club is one of these great venues that it's just an honor for anyone like myself to present at. So I feel triply blessed. In this book I wrote, Dead Men Ruling, I'm mainly trying to achieve two things with respect to the public. One, I am trying to attack the notion that's so common that we live in an age of austerity. I think we live in an age of extraordinary possibility, and I'll try to convince you of that as we go through the talk. But the second point is, I think we are at a unique fiscal turning point. And by fiscal turning point, I mean one that we simply can't avoid, that things have gotten to a point, an impasse, where things have to change. Even if we didn't want them to change, even if we disagree on the direction of change, it's a unique fiscal turning point, and it's a little bit different than the ones that we have in the past. And I'll try to show you why it's different from the past. But I want you, at the end of this talk, I'm going to talk about a lot of obstacles, but I want you to walk away with that positive message. Things are going to change. It's up to us to make them change for the better, and we live in an age of extraordinary possibility. We just have to reach out and grab it. So why, in part, do I say that we live in an age of extraordinary possibility? Well, one reason is that we're actually fairly rich as a nation. Yes, we went through a great recession, and yes, our income gains have been very small. We're actually a little richer than we were even before the Great Recession started. That doesn't mean on average the distribution is the way we might want it, but on average we're richer. Our gross domestic product, which is a measure of our total product, our income per household, is now in excess of $140,000 a household. If you take budget office projections, and I don't know whether they're right or not, they don't really know either, they say that our GDP per household, average per household, will grow to about $165,000. It'll grow to by another $25,000 over the course of the next 10 years. And that's really nothing more than a projection of 2 or 3% economic growth, modest relative to the past, but projected out for 10 years, that gives you, 25% richer economy. It gives you 25% more revenues for government. And I'll go through a few more of those numbers again. If we take government spending at all levels, federal, state, and local, we add in tax subsidies, which a lot of people don't do, but we add those in, and we count that as what government does. It's actually spending now on order of about $55,000 a household. This is not a budget for a poor nation. This is double what it was at the beginning of the Reagan era. And if we have economic growth, that $55,000 is going to grow to $65,000 perhaps in another 10 years, maybe a little less under Republicans, a little more under Democrats. But again, there are a lot of resources that we have. And I'm just giving you the financial numbers. We have an extraordinarily capable people. I'd like to hearken back to just a quick bit of history here. So when Governor John Winthrop was on the Arabella in 1630, and he spoke to his comrades on the ship, he said, we must understand that we will be as a city on a hill, the famous city on a hill quote. The eyes of the world are upon us. But the thing to be clear about in his statement wasn't that we are a city on a hill, and therefore it entitles us to, say, not pay more taxes, not to share in the distribution of benefits from government programs, to retire for 30 years or 25 years. It wasn't about what we were entitled to, it was what we were going to do to build together for the future. And if you think about what this nation has achieved, it basically created a nation out of a wilderness. It created the world's first thriving modern democracy, which was a standard for the world, one that not all the world has adopted by any means, but has spread throughout many parts of the world. We did a lot of things wrong, like slavery, but we also, our can-do nation actually did eventually conquer slavery and eventually even get to try to recreate and build up a civil rights agenda. We sent a man to the moon. We can argue about whether that was the best use of resources, but that was part of the spirit of the nation in operation. So we've always been sort of a can-do nation. So now, fast forward to today, what is going on? Why do we have this sense of pessimism, that we can't achieve things? Well, some people say it's because of the budget deficit. We have a deficit, so therefore we cannot do things. And some people say, well, we've got really bad political leaders in Washington, whether on the right or the left, Democratic or Republican, therefore we can't do things. And, there's some truth to these stories. Certainly could have better political leaders. That's always been true. But we've had some pretty bad political leaders in our past. In fact, I could give a number of cases that are far worse than any story you might come up with today. Think about when we're basically trying to retain slavery or trying to prevent civil rights, or we're in the McCarthy era, if you want. The political leadership question is crucial for moving forward, but it's not clear our leaders are worse. And this notion of a deficit is really a bit misleading. Again, take my numbers. I was talking about how much we already do as a government, how much more we can do. And so the deficit is barely a symptom of a broader problem. And that broader problem I define as basically a decline in fiscal democracy. And so my first slide here, which, sorry about that, I'm not sure which one's up here, shows basically that if you look over the course of our history and you compare the amount of spending we did on an automatic basis versus a discretionary basis, it's changed dramatically. This effort, this fiscal democracy index I've created, basically shows that for the first time in U.S. history in 2009, every dollar of revenue had been committed before Congress walked in the door. They were committed to things that in budget parlance are called entitlements or mandatory spending. That is, legislation that in the past predetermined how spending was going to come out in the future. Largely driven by retirement and health spending, spending growth was put on a very, very fast pace. In fact, in those two sets of programs, not just Social Security and Medicare, but military retirement and military health benefits and health benefits for civil servants across the board, Medicaid, you name it, those health and retirement programs have been growing continually faster than the economy, and more programs have been put on this mandatory basis. So we've taken discretionary out of the budget. And what I've done with this fiscal democracy index is to do nothing more than to estimate what % of revenues are left on a discretionary basis after you take away these mandatory programs. And what you'll see is 2009, no revenues were left. Everything we did on a discretionary basis was basically financed out of a deficit. Now, there's some recovery after the recession, but we go back downward towards where there's very, very little discretion left for Congress and the president if we keep these laws on the books. They don't even have to come in and vote on anything. These are the laws that predetermine where we'd be headed. So a lot of my book and my thesis is nothing more that we need to restore fiscal freedom to be able to do the things that we're capable of doing. So how did we get here? How did we get to this point in time? Well, part of it is that over the last few decades, politicians in both parties have more and more tried to operate on what I call the giveaway side of the budget. So don't think of the budget as taxes, financing, spending, and those are the two parts of the balance sheet. Think of it as the giveaway side of the budget and the takeaway side of the budget. The giveaway side of the budget are tax cuts and spending increases. That's where the politicians in every electoral campaign, right, tell us what they are going to give us with our money. But they're going to give us a tax cut, they're going to give us a spending increase. The takeaway side is how it's paid for. That's the tax increase and the spending cut. So I challenge anyone in our audience here physically or in a radio audience to think of any politician they know who's won office over what they're going to take away from us. It's not a good way to get elected. So more and more our politicians have operated on this giveaway side, but traditionally it was over what we did with discretionary spending. So as long as you're doing this only with discretionary spending, you have the advantage that economic growth always gives you leeway as you go into the future. So in a typical budget, even if the first year is in deficit, the long-run budget, the long-run set of obligations are not in deficit. Now, we didn't do 10-year projections in 1810 or even 1920 or in even 1950. But if we had done them and we had projected out 10 years, we would actually have seen that we would have massive surpluses under something called current law because it wasn't obligated. And the revenues would grow over 30 years. The economy would probably double. Revenues would double. Over an 8-year presidency, revenues would probably grow by 30%. There was leeway. There was ability for the politicians to operate on the giveaway side of the budget by dealing with those additional revenues. They could do a tax cut if they wanted to maybe make government a little smaller. They could do spending increases if they thought they wanted government to be a little larger. Now, there's a very interesting political history interpreted by both of the parties. For Republicans, there was a period where they did not have the House of Representatives for almost any year from about 1932 onwards. I think it was maybe about 4 years from 32 to till 94. And they didn't have the House of Representatives, and they hardly, at least in the period about the mid-70s, had not had the presidency. And sometimes some Republicans didn't want to count Eisenhower as one of their own anyway. And at that point in time, they actually looked at what was going on, and there was a writer called Jude Wanniski who wrote for the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And Wanniski argued in an article called The Two Santa Theory that the problem was the Democrats got to be Santa Claus, and Republicans had to do it too. That if they wanted to win elections, they had to offer tax cuts they didn't pay for the way he thought that Democrats offered spending increases the way that they didn't pay for. And in part, what he asked for, this two Santas, having tax cuts and spending increases, the giveaway side of the budget, we had in spades in the first decade of this century, even before the Great Recession. So if you look from the period about 2000 to 2007, even before the Great Recession, we did more than any other period in our history to increase domestic discretionary spending. This is a percent of the economy. To increase entitlement spending, we did a drug benefit for the elderly, which may have been worthwhile, but we decided we weren't going to pay for it. We were just going to add the benefit. We had defense spending increases, partly because of 9/11, and we had big tax cuts. And we moved more from surplus to deficit in that period than any other period in our history. The two Santas were operating in spades. And what has happened now is instead of having a budget where revenues continually rise faster than the economy, both the tax cuts and the automatic spending growth now puts spending on a path where it grows automatically faster than the economy and faster than almost any revenues that you can take in. And that's the dilemma in this long-term budget. And if you just simply try to do deficit reduction, get the deficit a little down this year, get the deficit a little bit down next year, you're still back in the box because that long-term budget continually stays out of balance. And this leads to four major economic problems and three major political problems. The four major economic problems, well, the first one, I think all of you know, you've read a lot about it, is we have a higher level of debt than we've had any time in our history except after World War II. But remind you, the debt is not scheduled to come down. After World War II, it was scheduled to come down fairly fast. The troops were coming home, right? The spending was going to be cut. They also raised taxes, by the way, to pay for the war. And it wasn't just to pay for the war then, but that higher tax rate lasted after the war ended. So they had all sorts of mechanisms to basically have huge revenue growth relative to the amount of spending that was obligated. That was after World War II. We're not in that situation anymore. Again, we're in a situation where the spending is scheduled to grow continually faster than revenue. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is once you're in this box, you have very little flexibility to deal with major emergencies. So Europe recently had a back-to-back recession. They also suffered from the Great Recession, and they had very little ability to engage in what's sometimes called counter-cyclical economic policy. That is, trying to let government do a little more to try to bring us out of a recession. If we have another recession soon, we've got a lot less flexibility built in the budget. It doesn't just have to be budget flexibility for recessions. You know, who knows? I mean, it could be another foreign disaster that leads us to need to spend more. It could be some disease. There are emergencies that we need to address, and there are actually needs we have as a society. The third major economic problem, and this is one to which Frank is going to speak about a bit more, is we really have a budget for a declining nation. So this spending growth we have, mainly in retirement and health, is oriented towards increasing our consumption. And that's fine. I think this was actually a great 20th century success, bringing people up to minimum levels of consumption. But it's not an opportunity budget. It's not a mobility budget if you're worried about what's happening to lower income people. It's mainly a consumption budget. It's mainly trying to ensure we get minimum levels of consumption. But what's happening, because discretionary spending has now been cut off so much, is programs like Programs for Children are going into a tailspin. So we're cutting off, in fact, most of the basic functions that were listed in our Constitution. And finally, we just have antiquated government across the board. The lack of flexibility is really leading to an inability to reform programs. And remember, programs don't always have to be reformed directly. Sometimes they're reformed simply by the fact that they're allowed to decline relative to the economy. So when we had welfare reform in the late 90s, it was a period where AFDC, which was what was defined by welfare in the 50s and 60s, had waned so much in importance relative to other programs that it was much easier to reform, and things like the earned income credit were able to come in as a replacement. And let me quickly go to the three political problems that this disease of trying to control the future creates. And they're all related to the last one that I've listed for those who see the list, and that is basically that we have politicians in the position where they have to renege on promises. So when you promise far more than you can ever deliver, the only way you can do things is to renege on those promises. A classic case of this was during the presidential debate between Governor Romney and President Obama. Both of them accused each other of cutting back on Medicare. Medicare is growing at an unsustainable rate, right? It's growing much faster than the economy. It's absorbing very large amounts of resources. So something has to be done. President Obama cut back on Medicare partly to pay for Obamacare. Whatever else you think about Obamacare, this was the attack that Governor Romney said, well, you're going to hurt the elderly. You shouldn't be cutting back on Medicare. I'm going to do more for them. Meanwhile, Governor Romney had proposed taking Medicare and possibly converting it more to a voucher-type program a la Paul Ryan, who's chair of the House Budget Committee. And the voucher program would set caps that would be adjusted over time. And President Obama accused Governor Romney, you're going to cut back on Medicare. Well, of course, both of them were going to cut back on it, but they couldn't admit it to the public. So you get politicians in this position where they are boxed into having to renege on a promise. It's not a promise they necessarily made. Renege on a promise for, say, high growth and health in this case, or if you want to, for low tax rates so low that we've added substantially to the debt and we're not paying our bills. That leads to all sorts of other political problems that I don't have time to fully go into. But just think about this argument that politicians can't agree today. Well, one reason they have trouble agreeing is because in the past they had money to give away. And now they've got to take money away from the public, and we, the public, often punish them, right? They are in a dilemma. If they lead, they often lose, right? President Clinton and Democrats believe that in '93 they did deficit reduction. They might exaggerate what they achieved, but they feel like what happened in this deficit reduction was at the end of the day they lost the House of Representatives in '94, and they basically financed George W. Bush's tax cuts in 2001. So they not only lost elections, they lost their agenda. So I want to move on quickly here to just back to my original thesis, which is we actually live at a time of as I say, of extraordinary opportunity. So here's where our budget is going now in terms of where we're spending. So if you project out 10 years in this budget, remember I talked about this budget that's going to grow over time and grow from, say, $55,000 per household to $65,000. Almost all of the spending growth goes for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, excluding children. Children get almost nothing. The discretionary spending gets almost nothing. And by the way, interest on the debt grows quite substantially, partly because interest rates are rising, but partly because we never raise enough revenues to pay our bills. So we have both sides trying to protect a low revenue base and a high growth rate, and basically we're squeezing an enormous number of other programs. But just to give you an idea that this does not mean that there's not opportunity, I again point to these numbers. This mandatory spending is scheduled to grow by about $9,000 or more. Discretionary spending is actually scheduled to go into decline. Deficits are going up. But we are actually in a period where we're planning on spending more. If I convert this per household number to a more aggregate number, 10 years from now, we're scheduled to spend about $1 trillion more than we are today. So if we could just recapture the ability to orient this growth rather than having it controlled by dead men, and yes, they were men, they were not very many women were involved in, dead men from the past, if we could just sort of recapture the ability to orient this growth to where we think the greatest needs in society are, and we'll disagree among ourselves, but if we can bargain over that, I think we can actually solve a great many of the problems caused by this disease of trying to control the future. You know, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who is the author of The Little Prince, once said, "As for the future, your task is not to foresee it, but to enable it." Thank you.
Should I put this off? How's that? Thanks, Bob, for your wonderful introduction, and thank you, Jean, for your many years of service, and especially for the fresh thinking that you've been sharing with us today. I'm really delighted to be here at the Commonwealth Club, both to comment on Jean's message, but also to focus it. In particular, to focus on the impact of the issues he's discussing on young adults. Jean's thoughtful book captured my attention with the key insight that inspired its title: the idea that today's working Americans are rapidly losing control over the ability to influence even basic fiscal policy. It's a powerful insight, and one especially relevant to young people. As Bob mentioned, I spent many years in the finance business before returning back to my alma mater at UC Berkeley. Any Cal Bears in the audience? Go Bears. During my second stint on campus, I came to realize that today's graduates face not one, but two real-life challenges. Together, these twin challenges are producing a level of generational inequity, which, while already uncomfortable, is poised to get much more difficult as baby boomers continue to retire. Jean essentially describes the first of these challenges in his talk and in his book, namely the inability of our federal and state governments to develop a sustainable fiscal plan. Young people especially understand well the concept of sustainability. We now know that a lack of a sustainable environmental practice around the globe has dramatically accelerated climate change. Young people get that and have taken a leading role in doing something about it. Well, it seems to me that Jean has clearly shared with us that the lack of sustainable fiscal policies will produce fundamental and unpredictable change in the country's finances. Like climate change, we know it's coming long before the worst of its effect arrives. I said that today's young adults face a pair of challenges. The second of these challenges is a direct challenge of succeeding as stewards of their own personal economies. Let me briefly describe the situation facing millennials today. Millennials are 18 to 35-year-olds. Bob mentioned this. For the first time in U.S. history, today's young adults believe that as a generation, they're unlikely to be financially better off than their parents. 80 million strong, millennials are more numerous than baby boomers, yet are burdened with fewer job opportunities, massive student loan debt, and the prospect that they'll be saddled with paying for America's unsustainable fiscal policies. Pressured financially, too many young people feel neglected by their government and also by financial services industry, which views them as unprofitable. The result is a generation of consumers left to their own devices. Less than a third are cash flow positive, and nearly half don't pay their bills on time. Now, there is good news. The private sector innovation in financial services will soon go a long way to helping the next generation deal with the financial mess that we're dumping in their collective laps. Most of this innovation is happening outside of traditional financial institutions, and quite a bit of it's happening right here in the Bay Area. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. And earlier I said that I think there's an uncomfortable level of generational inequity, and here's what I mean. If we start by looking at net worth of young adults, according to Pew Research, in the last 30 years, the average net worth of a young adult has declined by 70% in real dollars, from $11,500 to $3,600. At the same time, by the way, that figure for retired Americans rose by 42% in real dollars to $170,000. But it's not just about assets. You may have heard that the New York financier Stanley Druckenmiller recently conducted a nationwide college tour talking about generational equity. If you haven't seen his presentation, I actually encourage you to Google it, because he has a very thoughtful and compelling way to talk about this issue. But one of his many points is that over the last 50 years, following on your consumption comment, Jean, consumption per person by Americans in their 70s has grown 400% faster than consumption of those same individuals in their 20s. And a substantial majority of that increase is driven by government policies redirecting new resources in one direction, opposite of the other direction. Now, of course, we all know that education is also a great equalizer. When I grew up going to California public schools in the 60s and the 70s, the US had the #1 K-12 system on the planet. Today, America doesn't make it in the top 35, according to PISA rankings. And as a result, Americans between the ages of 55 and 65 have literacy, numeracy, and technology skills that are well above average relative to the rest of the industrialized world. Younger Americans, though, are definitely not keeping pace. Those between 16 and 24 rank near the bottom of all rich countries, far behind their counterparts in Canada, Australia, Japan, Scandinavia, for example. Now, is this really a surprise? Jean's book tells us that the federal government spends $4,000 on a child and about $26,000 on every elderly American. So what do we do about it? A pair of formidable challenges requires more than one fix. Jean and others who know Washington well are going to have to help us navigate our fiscal sustainability problem. I'm a private sector guy. I want to talk about the fact that there's a set of conditions developing in the private sector that should produce real change. Innovation in financial services is going to demystify personal financial management, making it approachable by all. It will substantially lower the costs of both credit and asset building products, and will usher in an era where individually tailored financial products perfectly suited and appropriate for a single individual's financial circumstances will become the norm for most Americans, not just for those with substantial resources. In fact, this kind of innovation is already being implemented and being made possible through a combination of massive processing power of cloud computing, ongoing software innovations, and the real-time delivery of information to the supercomputer that we all carry in our pocket, a smartphone. So briefly, since I know I have limited time, let me describe two efforts that are already delivering on what I'm suggesting. At Level Money, a company I co-founded after I left Berkeley, we deliver to our members confidence and clarity about their personal finances. By downloading the application to their phone, our members are able to link their spending accounts to our technology platform, allowing us to use the underlying transaction data in their bank and credit card accounts to automatically detect their income, automatically identify all their fixed expenses, so that in under a minute, we can tell them how much they can spend this week or today to stay in the black. This information is updated nearly real time, all day long, on your phone for free. We build many tools on top of this. Soon we're adding a goal-oriented feature, that savings feature that will allow members to tell the phone, I mean like literally just tell the phone, what you want to purchase in the future and when you want it. And we'll automatically adjust your weekly spendable so that you're effortlessly saving for what you want and not putting it on your credit card. The real power, though, of what we and others are doing lies in the data that we aggregate and that we develop. Leveraging some important machine learning algorithm work being done out of MIT, we now know that financial transaction data, the data of what transactions that happen in your spending accounts, is a very powerful tool to predict financial health. Properly analyzed transaction data alone is a better indicator of default, for example, than FICO scores. Still, most banks only use backward-looking FICO scores to decide to whom give credit. Soon, a much more inclusive and accurate market will develop that links pools of capital from around the world directly to borrowers, all powered by sophisticated machine learning algorithms that, at very, very low incremental cost, will develop and target highly tailored, personalized credit and other products directly to consumers. These innovations will take huge costs out of the system, more accurately price risk to individual consumers, delivering value in the chain. Happily, some of this is already actually happening. We're not just talking about the future, it's already here today. A second quick example of private sector financial innovation is the dramatic, ongoing change in the asset management industry. I met recently with a couple of entrepreneurs who've developed the first free online financial advisory business. They use technology to aggregate assets, and then based on the answers that you give to a series of questions, they develop an asset allocation strategy for you, dynamically optimized over time, all in the base product for free. They're taking even further the model that was developed by Wealthfront, which is a Bay Area company, and Betterment, which manages your money in a very sophisticated way for 25 basis points, or 1/4%, about a 75% discount from what the traditional brokerage firms charge to manage your money. Now, I could go on, but I'm out of time. So let me end by saying that, luckily, we don't need to wait for technology-inspired innovation to help millennials take charge of their personal financial lives. In fact, they're already doing so. Today's millennials are twice as likely to not have a revolving credit card as those 10 years older were at the same age. Importantly, having seen what the effects of debt have been on their parents, the average millennial has reduced her credit card debt by 1/3 since 2007. So personally, I'm very optimistic that we're on the cusp of a major transformation in consumer finance, which will empower people, and especially young people, to take back control of their personal financial lives. Now, Gene, if we can just get the government to do the same. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gene and Frank. I'm going to ask them a question while I go through your questions. I think, both of you delivered sobering truths about the challenges we face. But I think what particularly attracts me to both of you is that you're inveterate optimists. Gene, you talked about an age of extraordinary possibility. And I think, Frank, you see that in the marketplace as well. I guess I'd like to ask each of you to expand on the opportunity you seek. Gene, there's a compelling passage on page 134 of your book, which, by the way, I highly recommend. It is as readable as it is fact-based. And you talk about a 21st century agenda toward investment, particularly in children, and away from ever-expanding consumption, towards opportunity and upward mobility, not just adequacy, and toward lean government that abandons policies that do not work or violate fundamental principles of fairness or equal justice. I'd ask you to expand on that. And Frank, I think Level Money is more than just an app, right? It's the beginning of a concept. You talked to me at one point about creating an AARP for young people. And I think everybody would be pretty interested in your expanding on that vision.
So imagine if we were in 1880 and we were still sitting around and debating the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That's in some ways the way I feel government debates are going on. I make the case in the book, you may not fully agree with this, that actually the 20th century agenda of both Democrats and Republicans, particularly the last half of the 20th century, they actually both won. That Democrats actually succeeded in building a fairly large social welfare structure, mainly protecting the elderly. I say mainly providing minimum levels of consumption. Most people are not starving or lacking clothing. Whatever we think of Obamacare, we're coming close to providing health care for most people. The consumption agenda has largely succeeded. And for Republicans, they were mainly concentrated, at least in a fiscal sense, on the top tax rate, which at one time was 90% coming out of World War II. They got it lowered to 70, to 50, to 40. Now there's a debate. It's probably back up to 40. It got down to about 35 or 28, depending on how you count at one point. But they largely won their agenda. And both of them are trapped in fighting these old battles. And so some of my sense of optimism is partly that it's time for them to move on, and they are actually starting to talk about it. I make a prediction with you that you will hear in this next presidential campaign, not so much this congressional campaign, you'll hear the words opportunity and mobility bounced around continually. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats don't want to talk about redistribution because they don't think it, even if they believe in it, they don't think that necessarily sells. But both parties really hold on to the American dream. And they want to talk about mobility and opportunity, and it will be a major issue. And I actually think that is the part of the 21st century agenda. And I'm optimistic that we are going to gradually turn to it, partly because I think the old agendas have largely succeeded. But that 21st century agenda, I don't want to say it's an easy one, because it's somewhat easy to give people money and ensure that they're going to consume some minimum levels, right? If I give you money, you'll probably spend it, or maybe save it that your children can spend it. But if I give you the opportunity for education, if I give you the opportunity to save, that's a little harder. You might not take advantage of that opportunity, no matter how much, say, money the government puts in it. So it's a harder agenda, and yet our issues of inequality, mobility in society are ones I think to which we are starting to turn. I think most of us think that it has to do with really beefing up and strengthening our educational system, working on things like wage subsidies, working on things that Bob and Frank work on, which is asset development either for the young or for low-income populations. Those are the agendas of the future, and I think we're actually moving toward them. And so I'm actually optimistic that we're going to do that. As I say, we're a rich nation, and I mainly gave you financial numbers, but again, we're still extraordinarily rich in the capabilities of our people. We're still among the most entrepreneurial nations in the world, and so I'm a long-run optimist, even if I'm a little bit of a short-run pessimist.
Frank, and can you also repeat the website for your app?
Sure, it's levelmoney.com. I would concur that fundamentally I'm very optimistic. I said it in my talk. I'm optimistic that innovation around the private sector is going to allow us to do a lot of things that many in Washington want to do through regulation, and some of that may happen, but it's going to happen more quickly through innovation, because there are huge embedded costs and diseconomies that exist inside the financial industry, inside these financial institutions. And the three big trends that I identified, big data, cloud computing, ongoing software developments, and the ubiquity of technology in your pocket, are enormous enablers of change. And so I believe that huge new opportunities for people to have confidence, clarity about their own financial life is going to influence their behaviors, is going to reduce predatory pricing, and do a lot of things that are really great. To your second point, and I want to let you get to questions in the audience because I'm interested in them. Yes, we have a belief at Level Money that if we deliver in a ruthlessly honest and transparent way, high-quality, personalized financial advice to young people, that over time we may be fortunate enough to earn their trust. And if we continuously earn their trust, that we may be in a position to, through a parallel foundation, form some kind of AARP for young people. That young people deserve to have a concentrated way to express their voice. And if I happen to also believe, optimistically, that whether we do it or not, this is coming in any case, that there's going to be enough energy around this topic and enough enthusiasm that we're going to have concentrated positive energy coming out of young people focused not only on environmental issues, not only on social issues, but in fact on fiscal issues too.
Can I add just one quick footnote? Another reason for my optimism is actually sitting next to people like Frank Gehry and Bob Friedman, who in their earlier parts of their lives have been extraordinarily successful and then devote a good deal of their time and their money and their efforts to trying to create a better world. And to people like you who are trying to really educate themselves and do better. I think de Tocqueville was right about the extraordinary ability of Americans together to reorganize, to create, we have more charities and nonprofits than any nation in the world. And a lot of that is just this entrepreneurial spirit, not just playing out at the level of say, business or producing better products, but at actually trying to just build a better world. So that also adds to my optimism. So thank both of you.
Thank you, Gene and Frank. So having talked about optimism, the next question talks about pessimism. Everything Gene spoke about, even the title of his book, points to the political intractability as the central problem that causes all other problems. What are your core recommendations to this political problem? And if I might elaborate, not that that's totally necessary, I mean, you talked about no politician wants to talk about takeaways, only about giveaways. We're already, you're critical of the grand bargains that people have attempted and have failed because they only deal with the immediate deficit or a portion of it, not the long-term commitments. You do point to two periods in our history, the Revolutionary War period and the Progressive Era, where we did accomplish substantial fiscal reform. I guess the question is, why do you think we can achieve this now?
So, the definition of a pessimist is someone who smells the scent of flowers and looks around for a casket. So, I try. In my book, I do point to the period post-Revolutionary War. Most people don't think about the extraordinary struggle we went through in terms of building the Constitution, creating a treasury, creating our initial tariff system. But in point of fact, what led to the Constitution was largely a fiscal issue. So it wasn't just that we weren't paying our debts from the Revolutionary War to foreign countries, so we couldn't trade, so it was hampering business development. But it was also that the soldiers during the Revolutionary War hadn't been paid. They were, in fact, the officers were ready to march on the Capitol after the war was over, and it was George Washington who appeared before them and put on a pair of spectacles and said that he'd grown old in the service of his country and basically stopped them. So, I mean, we don't really have people trying to march on Washington with arms today. So there have been periods in the past where we were at fiscal impasses. and we had to move on. And part of this is just my sense of history. As I said, I think we're at a turning point. I think, and I try to make the case in the book in other ways, is we have to move on. Whether we do it well is another question, and the length of time we take to do it is a crucial matter, because that's going to affect, that could, we could have a lost generation in terms of who benefits or who doesn't along the way. But part of it is we have to move on, and we do have, and we have had at times in the past, extraordinary leaders. Now, the difficult issue, and I don't have time to get to this great detail, but this is a classic dilemma, sometimes called a prisoner's dilemma, where, as I said, if you lead, you lose, and it requires processes, and I talk about some of these, where you have to be able to have ways of getting both parties together and holding them. It's almost like two Ulysses tied to the mast and not just one, where they basically agree to do something that's in their common interest if they work together, but it's only in their common interest as long as the other party can be held bound by that set of rules. And there are people who work on these different processes. I offer 7 or 8 in my book. I think we will move in that direction. And I also have some trust that political leadership will rise to take advantage of this as we move forward.
One of my favorite quotes was Herb Stein, who I think was economic advisor to President Nixon, who said, if something can't last forever, it probably won't. We hope that's the case. Now I have a couple questions, actually, a similar question, but I think directed at each of you. One, how will financial services innovation reach across socioeconomic and racial disparities that already exist when it comes to accessing economic opportunity? Frank, for you. And for Jean, how do we get more diversity, gender, racial, socioeconomic, in our budget and policy discussions?
So I'll start. It's a great question, and it's also something I'm very optimistic about. It comes down to, in a distributed model, the numbers don't lie. And what we're learning is that if you bring to bear massive computing power against large amounts of data, and you can anonymize or not anonymize the individuals that are involved, new kinds of financial institutions are going to cut through traditional ways of thinking about the question. This is already happening, where we see, in fact, I was with a group yesterday that's using huge numbers of data inputs, social data, financial data, other history they get from merchants, to make the evaluation as to whether they should extend credit. This is one example. And so by taking it away from the staid traditional way of thinking about credit allocation and bringing in a highly analytical, multivariable analysis, I believe that will much more accurately assess risk. And when we're much more accurately assessing risk and getting rid of biases, we're going to extend risk more appropriately to a much broader number of people. Because at the end of the day, the hedge fund in Geneva that wants to make a return on its investment ultimately is going to follow what the numbers say. And I think that there's great opportunity to distribute credit and asset products much further down the socioeconomic spectrum by inviting many more players to the table and making it highly analytical in terms of its outlook.
So let me stick with the financial examples. All three of us, particularly the two people, one to my left and one to my right, work also on asset development in a lot of different ways. Bob has been heading up the Corporation for Enterprise Development as chair and other roles for many years, working on asset development for low-income people, which often are people of color, formerly. By the way, we can't apparently use the term minorities anymore. That's no longer politically correct because we're all minorities, which is or soon will be minorities. And I think that people have come up with a lot of innovative ways of doing this, both in terms of the private sector and in terms of government possibilities. I will go back to my theme of dead men ruling. One thing that happens, and I go to conferences all the time about, well, why haven't we made more progress on Early Start or Head Start for children, which tends to succeed when it's a quality education? Or why haven't we made more progress on asset development for low and moderate income people? Most moderate income and even middle income people now go in retirement with very little in the way of retirement assets. I think, now this is after the Great Recession, the median amount of retirement assets of someone 55 to 60, the median amount was like about $12,000. That excludes the people who have pensions. This is the 401k set of numbers, but the numbers are very small. And the median amount, I think, for people who actually had 401ks was still only about 100,000. And mind you, a typical couple retires for more than a quarter century between the two of them. One or other of the couple was likely to live 25 years in retirement. So that's not enough money. So I think one way you move forward is you start putting people back on savings paths. And the two biggest saving paths are basically investing in housing, as bad as that turned out to be in the 2005-06 period, because you're paying off that mortgage year after year after year, even if the house goes down in value. And the second main way that most people save is they save in retirement assets. Now, I'm not saying other people don't save in corporate stock or small business, but those are the two main ways people save. And when you get them on these automatic paths of saving, it actually adds substantially to their income. And there are ways we have of doing that. There's some pretty easy ways of getting people to save a lot more in financial assets, which would stretch to lower income people and often many people of color who don't have much saving. What blocks it gets back to the theme of the book, is it actually, in the case of putting more money aside in pensions, is you would actually end up with a revenue cost, because the revenue numbers over 10 years, as people put more deposits in tax-deferred accounts, they would pay less taxes up front. And the Congressional Budget Office would come up with numbers and say, well, this is going to cost us $5 or $10 or $20 billion to really expand retirement assets for low-income people. So nobody offers that type of proposal. So the two things go hand in hand. I think we know ways to appeal to people with low income and people of color and people who lack assets. But in some ways, we're sort of blocked from going there right now.
Bob, can I make one more comment
Sure.
forgot to make, which is I think about what Amazon.com or Overstock.com has done to retailing by taking huge costs out of the system and creating more competition. And this is, new innovations in financial services are going to take massive costs out of the system that are currently primarily happening at big financial institutions. And as those costs go out, the money is going to flow down and there's going to be more opportunities available.
Great. So I'm supposed to remind our audience that this program is presented by the Commonwealth Club. This afternoon we're hosting Dr. Gene Sterling of the Urban Institute and Frank Yeary of Level Money, who are discussing how politics have negatively impacted the federal budget process and entrepreneurial solutions. I'm Bob Friedman. The next question, I don't know that I'm supposed to know who asked these questions, but I have an idea of who did ask this one, and it's my favorite ability warrior, Neil Jacobson, one of the founders of the World Institute on Disability. 50% of people living in poverty say they have one or more disabilities, yet there is little synergy between disability movement and people working to eradicate poverty. Why is that? And if I might add to this, we define people with disabilities as unable to engage in substantial gainful activity. We define them out of the labor market, so that it should be no wonder that 70% are unemployed. This is where I think, Gene, you talking about a shift from an adequacy agenda to an opportunity agenda is so important.
Right. I think where there's common ground is on the work agenda. I think a great many people who have handicaps or disabilities, or for that matter, are just elderly and have various limitations, however we define them, want to be engaged. Now, it might be in the formal marketplace, it might be informally with their neighbors and charities or with their family, but most people really want to be engaged. That's how we get our identity. And as I say, these programs that we've had in the past, which I consider quite valuable in trying to provide these minimum levels of consumption, really have not had that mobility, that work agenda as part of it. We have had an earned income credit. It's largely gone to families with children, often who are alternatively on welfare. It hasn't even gone to single people. It hasn't gone to low-income workers who might marry into another low-income family. They actually would end up creating a huge marriage penalty and losing benefits. It hasn't gone often to the disabled and people who are impaired. And I think that what we need to start thinking about is ways of putting more of our resources into that particular work agenda, because I think that's how these two parts of the puzzle come together. And Bob's right. Right now, because we have trouble measuring often the extent of impairments or disabilities across some spectrums, not across all of them, the definition of who's disabled or not for government purposes or government receipt of government programs is you don't work. If you work, you prove that you're not eligible for the benefit, and this is really something in the long run we have to deal with. I think if we build up this other agenda, this subsidized of work agenda, providing opportunities to people to engage one way or the other, I think we gradually reduce the necessity to measure so much on whether people, using something like whether people work or not as a measure of whether they have needs that need to be subsidized.
Frank, did you want to comment?
I would, Gene is more eloquent on this topic than I will be, except to say that I also think that the growth of the knowledge economy provides opportunities in this area. And there's great need for all kinds of talents and great competition for talent in the knowledge economy. The Bay Area is a terrific example of this. And so I think as a general matter, that's opportunity-oriented and increasing opportunities across the spectrum.
Great. The next two questions go to persistent government deficits. We spend a lot of money on interest. If the government could issue money into existence instead of borrowing it, wouldn't that solve much of our fiscal crisis? And the other is, if we were to take the power of money creation away from the commercial banks and the Fed and restore that power to Congress, wouldn't that go a long way toward fixing the fiscal crisis? And if I might embellish a little, Gene, I think you note in your book, and it's an important theme, that running persistent deficits is simply a way of shifting the costs to future generations. And Thomas Piketty, in the last chapter of Capital in the 21st Century, says that to the extent that government doesn't pay its bills, it essentially rewards the holders of capital, the wealthiest among us, in terms of paying more to them, further exacerbating inequality. So I guess the question is, what should be our position on deficits?
Well, part of this question has to do with monetary policy, too, and I do have some concerns with monetary policy. Again, if one goes back historically to the purpose of loans, the main purpose of loans was to get money from savers to investors where both could benefit from the transactions. So the saver puts up the money, the investor has the entrepreneurial idea of how to invest it, and makes some of the money which is then shared with the saver. Monetary policy, I think, in part has expanded quite a bit then because now loans don't just go for business. Eventually we decided, well, we should count buying homes as part of what loans should go for. And more also, I think a number of Wall Street entrepreneurs have also figured out that a lot of times there are all sorts of classic arbitrage situations where they just see a chance to take advantage of something that's mispriced a little bit and borrow a great deal. And so we've gone less and less towards the notion where we're subsidizing the actual entrepreneurial business spirit and more towards consumption and a number of financial transactions. Not that all of that is bad, but I think we've got to get back, as I think Frank's trying to do, to working on the saving side of the agenda. Would I, with those caveats on monetary policy, take the Fed out of the hands of the current policymakers and send it over to Congress? And I don't think so. Congress has a lot of trouble making decisions. Decisions are highly politicized. This doesn't mean the Fed doesn't get things wrong, but I'd rather have a more neutral body, at least an attempt to create a neutral body to do this. And we have great examples from our past, including one of probably the greatest recession in our history, which was caused by Andrew Jackson when he closed the National Bank and caused a huge depression because we didn't have a monetary policy in place. So I'd be careful with trying to put monetary policy into too political of a dynamic.
Okay, from broad monetary policy to specific help. As a student graduating from college in 1 year, how can I best prepare myself? How do I navigate grad school versus the job market?
Well, is there an easier one?
you have any jobs?
Yeah. So this is, I think the paradigm to look at this involves thinking about what your immediate options are and whether you're taking on student loans to finance, in particular, your current education and your graduate school education. What I would say is one of the surprising things that we learned early in our research, first of all, it wasn't surprising how emotional the student loan issue was for so many people. That was not a surprise. But it was surprising to me how many people who had some level of student loans, found themselves in a difficult job market, decided to go back to graduate school 100% on student loans because they could stop the payment on their loans, which they were worried about, because they were struggling to make, and so they ended up doubling or tripling the amount of debt. So this is not a path in general, that there are many great reasons to go to graduate school perhaps, but think about whether the NPV, the net present value of the debt you're going to take on in graduate school is going to be advanced by the earnings potential that you're going to have when you get out. I mean, this is bringing a thought to this question about is it worth it? I was at a university. I have to say I was stunned at the cost now of some graduate schools, professional graduate schools running $75,000 a year for business school, engineering school, law school. These are very, very important decisions. Just like I happen to believe that even the decisions of many young people to take on student debt when they come in and what majors they're majoring in are things that deserve, in many instances, more thought than the schools encourage their students to give. So, I would think hard about whether the specific opportunities ahead of you are materially advanced by going to graduate school, and if you're paying for it, make sure it's going to be worth it.
So I'd just add a footnote of even though one might be young, you still should look at what the market is demanding. So, there are jobs in areas like healthcare. There's certainly jobs. I know at Urban Institute, we constantly look at whether people, not necessarily whether they're economists or they're math majors, but we do look at how much they've taken quantitative courses. That's part of the area where the demand is. If one wants to be an actress and it's got a high unemployment rate, I encourage people to sort of maximize their options. The development of several skills is often better than one where you're relying upon that. And this is the same issue that not just young people face, but people of all ages face, although I would agree that young people today face more obstacles than certainly our generation did when we were young.
We're coming to the end of our time, so allow me to, again, combine three related but slightly different questions. Is America evolving from a corporate to an entrepreneurial economy? And if so, how will that affect our future? What is unique about the American economic climate as compared to other countries? And do you think your advice would change with changing economic circumstances? You didn't want easy questions, right?
Well, so I would say what we know about the economy, the first parts of those questions, what's the nature and the direction of the economy going? Is it going away from corporate towards entrepreneurial? Well, we've known for a long time, Gene will know the specific numbers, that virtually all of the job creation that happens in the country happens in small businesses. Major corporations play a role, but they don't, in general, play a role creating massive new job opportunities. So I believe we've been, the entrepreneurial energy has been driving job creation for a long time. I think that we are at a moment of the following real conundrum. So I sit on the board of Intel. In short, every year we struggle to hire the number of technical talent, particularly technical talent in America, that we want. There are not enough people who can do the jobs that we want every single year Now, luckily, as a brand name company, we end up attracting them. But I would say the opportunities for us to bend this economy curve, to bend this entrepreneurial curve, is to encourage a thoughtful embrace by actually people up and down the age spectrum to be embracing the knowledge economy. Because I'll give you one last fact. STEM-related jobs, STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, STEM-related jobs are the fastest growing jobs in America. STEM-related majors are the slowest growing majors on college campuses. So this is not the prescription for us that we need. We need the second of those to be fixed, and we need people up and down the age and up and down the socioeconomic ladder to be embracing the reality of the knowledge economy and the opportunity that it creates. And if we do that, a lot of great things will happen.
So I think I'm going to confine myself to answering the last of the questions, since I think Frank answered the first two fairly well. And would my advice change as the economy changes? And I think the answer is definitely yes. The thesis of my book is that we need to create flexibility. So, this is not, you don't need to be a genius to figure this out. Joe Theismann, a well-known football quarterback, once said, you don't need to be a genius to understand football. A genius is someone like Norman Einstein. And I'm claiming we need, I'm not saying we need a totally flexible budget. We need certain, if for instance, if elderly are promised some real benefit, they've retired, then we need to keep that benefit level over time. I think that's an obligation we have. But in general, we need to create flexibility so that we can actually respond to changes in the economy. And not just changes in the economy that I think maybe we would agree upon, but maybe changes we would disagree upon. Each generation often has different wants and desires. Some want a larger government, some want a smaller government. We have to create the type of government processes that allow those decisions to be made in a democratic way, because in a democratic way we avoid fighting, we avoid a lot of the violence that we see in so many other countries around the world, and we have ways of moving forward in processes that work. So yes, the answer to the question, would my advice change as the economy changes? Yes, I hope it would change, because I really don't know the answers. In fact, I very much ascribe to a school of thought that Herb Stein, whom Bob already quoted, once said he belonged to, and that's the I don't know school of economics. And there's a lot that I confess I do not know.
Well, that seems the perfect note to end on. There's a lot we don't know. Thanks to these two folks, Gene Sterling and Frank Yeary, there's a lot we do know. I want to thank them for their comments today, even more for your life work. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience here and listening for coming and participating in this discussion. I know that fiscal policy is not necessarily the most attractive of all topics. I think you'll agree with me, these kind of questions are quintessentially important. And I would recommend you read Gene's book, Dead Men Ruling. For those of you who are listening to this, www.deadmenruling.com will get you to the book. And then Frank's is Level Money, www.levelmoney.com. I think you will find that app quite useful. Anyway, thank you all for a stimulating hour.